So we are moving now directly to our next presenter, Ioannis Kampourakis. Ioannis, did I say it correctly? I'm sorry.
Yes, I think the last time it was right.
Apologies. From Erasmus University in Rotterdam, who's going to discuss something quite related, but I think a paper that really enriches the conversation. And he's going to be talking about transparency legislation, global value chains, decentralization, market power, and global hierarchies. I think we will find a very rich conversation happening here today. I can already see the various ways that Tamara and my paper are really related to all of the questions that are coming up here. So thank you very much, Ioannis, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hila. And well, first of all, let me thank you, Hila, and Bimal and Shilpi for suggesting this volume and organizing it and bringing us together. I think this is really an exciting and actually an important project, and I'm very happy to contribute. And thank you, class, for opening the discussion on global value chains and transparency, which is essentially the same topic I will be addressing. So my contribution also focuses on transparency legislation in global value chains as a recent regulatory attempt to combat modern slavery. And well, I guess also similarly to class, my paper also takes a more theoretical, conceptual angle, more critical angle perhaps. So the question that I pose in this paper is why the quest to combat modern slavery in supply chains has assumed the form of disclosure obligations, what this form of legal obligations actually signifies, and whether it is a form that in itself has the potential to deliver on its aspirations to tackle modern slavery. And more broadly, one could say to pave the way for social sustainability, because we see transparency regulation not only in the field of not only with regards to modern slavery, but more broadly in as a way to address social and environmental sustainability. So the ambition of this chapter, the ambition of this paper, is to propose a critique of the conceptual core of transparency legislation and its decentralizing reflexive logic. So how I will proceed for this presentation is that I will first briefly, try to unpack, let's say, transparency legislation, talk about, in a way to set the scene, then try to clarify what I mean by the logic and rationale of transparency legislation, unpack the logic and rationale, and finally move on to critique. So by transparency legislation, just following up on class, of course, just to be on the same page, I mean, the various laws that impose these non-financial reporting requirements on corporations with, usually it could be with regards to their social and environmental impact in supply chains, but I focus on the paper particularly in how such laws target modern slavery. And of course, a paradigmatic example class discussed, and I know Hila also and Tamara discussed in their paper, is the 2015 Modern Slavery Act, which requires that companies that supply goods or services in the UK prepare an annual statement that outlines the steps they have taken to ensure that modern slavery and human trafficking are not taking place in their supply chains. And in a very, let's say, light touch approach to compliance, the law suggests that the content of that statement, of this annual statement, may include information about different categories, while the law also allows companies to simply confirm that they have taken no steps whatsoever to eradicate modern slavery from their supply chains. And in fact, this kind of, opt-out clause is not unique to the Modern Slavery Act, but we can also see it in the Australian Modern Slavery Act of 2018 and the California Transparency Supply Chains Act of 2010. We can see similar, let's say, opt-out clauses. So what we see is that transparency legislation does not really rely on top-down legal sanctions, but rather seeks to become impactful by triggering market and civil society oversight of supply chain practices, as well as more, subtle forms of shareholder stewardship. And this points to the goal of seeing lead firms essentially incorporate social values, let's say, beyond profit maximization, as they themselves are meant to become the regulators of their global value chains. So as already hinted with regards to the light touch approach to compliance of the Modern Slavery Act, a widespread critique against non-financial transparency, not only with regards to modern slavery, is that it is not effective. Klaus already talked about this. The lack of enforcement is seen by many, and not without a reason, of course, that it is seen like that the regulation is eventually toothless. Disclosures are often too selective and superficial, and the information that most companies provide do not allow readers to properly understand and appreciate their impact. Also, reporting schemes might even allow companies to camouflage unsustainable practices as sustainable, and disclosures could even be used as a pretext to displace more intrusive forms of regulation. So my goal for in this paper is to build on this type of functional critique, which I think obviously has merit, but also try to go beyond and criticize the logic of transparency legislation beyond its effectiveness. So really boil down to what the logic of the rationale of this type of regulatory intervention really is. And I suggest that transparency legislation constitutes an aspiration of decentralized regulation through the workings of private actors. So to go back to the question of epistemology that Klaus already discussed, I think it rests on an epistemology that is defined by social complexity and the supposed inability, at least, of centralized social action, or let's say the state, to control the centrifugal dynamics of the global economy. So the starting point, in my opinion, is essentially the Hayekian knowledge problem for the construction of a social and economic order. And that is, how can any form of regulation be effective when there is no central authority that can have a functional overview over the dispersed knowledge of the market economy? As such, transparency legislation reflects a certain, again, like in Hayekian terms, humility, or perhaps you could say like low ambition about the potential of centralized social engineering. So addressing modern slavery or sustainability more broadly is entrusted to the decentralized coordination of a plurality of market and civil society actors, with the state simply adjusting the incentives for the circulation of the necessary information. Behind this epistemology of decentralization lies eventually this vision of a spontaneous order of the market economy able to readjust itself to incorporate social concerns. At the same time, of course, transparency legislation might create new dynamics and opportunities for global value chain regulation and governance. And that goes in line with also what was discussed between Klaus and Doreen, especially at the Q&A, that the notion that lead firms can and must acquire information about the conduct of actors beyond their immediate vicinity frames indeed lead firms as potential regulators of these vast networks of supply chains. And by forcing firms to abandon their deliberate ignorance about what happens in global value chains, transparency legislation could indeed pave the way for new forms of supply chain liability. For example, what Doreen discussed before, corporate sustainability reports have been used by plaintiffs in recent cases of human rights violations to make the case for the existence of a prima facie duty of care of lead firms towards the workers and communities harmed by the activities of subsidiaries or suppliers. So transparency legislation challenges this the rigidity, let's say, of the classic dichotomies of hard law and versus soft law, or mandatory and voluntary forms of regulation. And one example is when firms engage in alliances and struggles with various stakeholders. So we have seen in the work of sociology or like empirical socio-legal studies in the field is quite illustrative. For example, thinking of the work of Tim Barclay, how when civil society actors can use the leverage provided by norms that are officially non-binding to achieve their own goals. And we see that in complex settings of global value chain governance, considerations of concrete reputational harm might be at times more significant than the distant possibilities of sanctions imposed by state law. So this is a classic case of the social reality of bindingness being actually different than the law in the books. However, and that brings me to the last point of discussion, the critique, it is questionable how pervasive really this erosion of the soft law, hard law dichotomy actually is in global value chain governance. And even if it is the case, it's actually also debatable whether such erosion actually favors the limitation of powerful corporate actors. So differences in firm size, purpose, and industry, and mostly exposure to consumer pressures could result in varying degrees of importance of reputational sanctions, and therefore affect accordingly attempts to tackle modern slavery. In addition, transparency legislation and the voluntary self-regulation it seeks to instigate eventually depend on the magnitude and the quality of the reactions of civil society and the market. Yet this social sphere, so the market and civil society, that has to trigger this process of internalization of social values, it has to act upon to exert this learning pressure on lead firms, on corporation. This social sphere that has to do all this is in itself a side of inequality. So the argument is that the reliance on social pressures to regulate corporate conduct essentially reifies existing market power asymmetries. And this is, I think, most evident from a global standpoint. So as the market oversight that is envisioned by transparency legislation is more likely to originate in the more influential end markets of the global north, transparency makes a social sustainability in the global south, where production takes place, actually eventually dependent on market activity in the global north. Another dimension of this global asymmetry is the question of democratic legitimacy of global value chain regulation of working conditions by states in the global north. Critical and 12 scholarship has been attentive to how the emergence of a transnational law without state can deprives even the ones who are supposed to benefit from such law from public voice. And I think the same could be said to apply to the transparency paradigm. And finally, that in the transparency paradigm, the contours of acceptable corporate conduct are not decided in, let's say, a centric fashion between different formally equal sovereign states through international negotiations, but it always remains flexible. So what the contours of acceptable corporate conduct are remain eventually flexible, open to be determined by the reactions of the market. And what market is this? Well, as I just said before, this is essentially primarily the markets, the end markets of the global north. So to conclude, I would like to focus maybe on one thought on the public-private divide, let's say, that I think could, let's say, inspire critique and reform. And this is the following. Global value chains, we often recognize, and scholarship in both international law and private law recognize that global value chains are permitted with law in the form of contractual governance. But what is often seemingly forgotten is that global value chains are also constituted by national and international law in the first place. So, in other words, we often recognize that changes in the global economy, such as the shift to offshore outsourcing, have profound implications for public governance. Yet at the same time, it is somehow forgotten that the changes in the global economy described were in the first place a product of institutional rearrangements. And for example, think about the reforms of in liberalizing trade and opening up markets for investment, or labor under-regulation, national labor under-regulation associated with export-led growth, and how this affected, let's say, the rise of offshore outsourcing. So on one hand, I think that taking corporate power seriously is necessary in the context of the globalized economy. And indeed, I do agree that lead firms have regulating capacities, which is something that the transparency paradigm, transparency legislation tries to exploit. On the other hand, it does not follow the designs of centralized social action, public enforcement, and international coordination are obsolete. As global value chains have been constituted by legal ordering could also dismantle, reform, or repurpose them. And an example, I think the recent interest of scholarly interest in the new international economic order proposals shows indeed that there might be avenues to think about centralized legal designs on an international level. So the logic of transparency legislation, beyond the practical shortcomings it has in being effective, might indeed open an avenue to make lead firms genuine regulators of transnational networks of production, which is something that could be instrumentalized, and let's say we should see in advancing it further. But at the same time, its decentralizing logic doubles down on the diffusion and the prevalence of transnational private ordering, instead of attempting to reassert some form of public power. But in fact, the recognition that global value chains are constituted by law in the first place should serve, I suggest, as a reminder that more ambitious projects of redesign of the global economy are not by default beyond reach. So that's it for me, and I'm looking forward to class comments and, of course, the discussion.
Yeah. So to enhance the kind of the interaction between papers, we gave class the opportunity to be the first commentator before all of us open it up. So class, the floor is once again yours.
Okay, thanks so much. Thanks, Ioannis, for, I mean, none of this is new between us. We've been discussing this a few times already, but as you know, very original and I think inspiring and important line of criticism, which nicely, I think, complements my paper, or is a paper that nicely works together with the first one, because precisely your line of criticism is on a different level, is at an even more sort of transformative level, and the let's say general architecture of your paper is not so much one that only tinkers with transparency from the inside, but really that puts transparency in a debate with its potential regulatory alternatives, be they liability, be they even more transformative of the international economic order, etc. Three main points, I would say, and you know those in their broad lines already. So the first one is you speak of, or you formulate the criticism of transparency in light of what you call the specific ambition of transparency. And in this, you have a very precise or you put forward a very precise picture of what transparency rules really carry as their ambition at their very heart. And I'm not sure if there is such a singular ambition, such a thing, singular telos behind transparency, or rather if the success of transparency actually comes from their open-endedness, from the fact that different actors have different hopes, the fact that civil society, some unions, some NGOs might be hopeful and count on effects just like the ones Doreen referred to, namely that reports can be productive for some, while other NGOs might be much more skeptical already, fearing the greenwashing. Some regulators may see this as a possibility to finally claim that they've done something about global value chains, while others will understand that it can be subverted, etc. So the very ambiguity of the functioning of transparency, which is, I think, what marks our debate so much, of some voices saying, but it does have an effect, while others say, but it's completely pointed. So this seems to be perhaps even the success story of transparency rules at large. And then I wonder if we take this plurality as a starting point, then the criticism that the specific ambition of transparency is one that endorses a peculiar type of epistemology. I wonder if this can really hold. The second one is then, so much of the criticism that you formulate, and I think rightly formulate, is informed or is known from criticism of reflexive law, indirect regulation, etc. And I wonder if there's anything in your eyes specific to transparency rules, as a subset of reflexive law. So can we copy paste the criticism? What is peculiar about transparency as compared to the lines of critique that we know from reflexive law as being somehow at this fine line between harnessing private power and at the same time trying to turn it against it. So is transparency in any way peculiar? And if so, how? And then thirdly, in your account of, or your criticism of transparency, does the existing diversity between how different legislations formulate transparency, does this make a difference? So is there, does the fact that the UK Modern Slavery Act has this, as you say, opt-out option, does this constitute an additional weakness of it, or can we basically take all of them together because they share the same epistemological deficits that you point us to, and because they hope to draw on the same commodification of sustainability interests, and they do the same power shifting from global south to global north, and ultimately to Western consumers that you criticize. So can there be an ideal type of transparency regulation, or is it doomed to fail altogether? Thank you.
Thank you, Klaas.
Thank you, Klaas.
So I'm opening up the floor before Ioannis will respond. So any questions or comments? Dev?
Yeah, well, I have a request to Ioannis. You mentioned how there is the mechanism of contractual governance, which ensures both control and formalizes power asymmetries. When you revise your draft, I hope you can put a couple of paragraphs to explain this and say how the power asymmetries are actually formalized in the contractual system. I would be very interested in getting some detail on that.
Thank you. Doreen?
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you. This was really a fascinating presentation, and I learned a lot. I was just wondering if we can think of, so if we look at it historically at the process of these transparency regulatory mechanisms and the way they evolved. So initially, they were conceived by many civil society critics as very weak and unpromising, and as you said, this was a continuous critique. And yet I wonder if it's actually their very weakness and the fact that that firms and companies and corporate interests conceived of them as kind of a greenwash they could handle is where their potential lies. So the fact that they were the fact that they were there, and we can actually somehow utilize them, manipulate them, civil society. I mean, I think that if you're really cynical about this, so the power relations are not going to change. The weak are going to stay weak. The poor are going to stay relatively poor. So it's not like so. Given that that's the set of circumstances we're about to deal with, then so I'm not sure that the mere kind of discrepancy in the power relations is something we can hope to undermine significantly. But actually, what we can do is try to use in very strategically and in a manipulative way the toolkit that was given us here in order to kind of turn the tables against those we think should be held accountable. So that's kind of one quick comment. The second quick comment is somewhat similar. It's about the North-South divide. So here I'm very much with you And I think that there's a huge problem in terms of voice and the democratic deficit that's kind of ingrained in these processes. Yet I'm not sure it cannot be remedied. So I do think that actually once this is exposed and reflected upon, this is a venue that could be addressed as well by civil society in various ways of and mechanisms that we're all familiar with. So I think that kind of bringing it to the fore is extremely important. I just don't think it's the last word. It's just the beginning. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. So I don't see any other hands. I'll jump in and just say, continuing Doreen and perhaps Klaas's comment as well, kind of putting a more positive twist on this. This is a question Tamara and I are really struggling with in our paper about the Modern Slavery Act, because it's clear that it's not the last word, as Doreen said. It's really a process, and it's in the making, and it reflects power relations as they exist now. And as Doreen said, as they will probably continue to exist for some time, and it creates a leverage, it creates a disruption in a sense, or a potential disruption, possibly not as disruptive as we would have liked, but something to hold on to. And the question I keep asking myself as I engage with these legislations is whether this is a distraction or an actual leverage, right? Is in using this, is it just a distraction for civil society to say, oh, but you have to tell us more, and reading all these these statements that are, you know, investing time in this, well, this is actually futile. And just, so I think there's a real strategic question here, coming from a perspective of someone who's of us trying to understand social change and legal change and business transformation. So please go ahead and try to respond.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. And thank you, Klaas, for taking the time to deliver these very insightful comments. I really appreciate it. So yeah, let me try to answer to this issue. So first, Klaas, starting with a question of like a specific ambition and so on. I do agree that in most of these pieces of legislation, the ambition is relatively broad and and open-ended in the sense that it targets social and environmental sustainability, for instance, in the EU non-financial reporting directive. I do think it's a bit different in the case of modern slavery-related transparency requirements, where the goal is much more concrete and it has to do with tackling modern slavery. So I do think that in a sense, there is, we can infer from, you know, the recitals, let's say, and the actual piece of legislation, we can infer a certain purpose. So the fact that things are relatively open-ended doesn't necessarily mean that, transparency legislation is really somehow a little bit about everything, and therefore, you know, trying to say that it doesn't deliver on what it promises is kind of doesn't make much sense. So I think there is always at least an implicit ambition, either inferred from the purpose of the legislation or actually from the recitals and how the law is framed, for example, in the European non-financial reporting directive. So whether transparency is a peculiar case or whether we can really apply the critique of reflexive law, well, I want to think about this a bit further, but like my primary answer would be that in a way, transparency legislation is the epitome of reflexive law legislation. It is a way of trying to, let's say, enhance learning pressures in society, trying to force corporations to engage with this kind of irritations and eventually try to achieve some sort of self-limitation of corporations as a result of this kind of civil society and market oversight. So I would say it seems to me that, at least at first, it really fits the theoretical outline. But yeah, it's something also to think about further, whether you know, the potential of what we discussed before, the potential of forcing corporations to abandon their deliberate ignorance about things that happen beyond their vicinity is something that changes dramatically. Let's say this does make then the theoretical scheme equally applicable. Then The last point about whether different types of legislation on transparency are should be treated the same in a uniform way, like as if they have this, being seen as if they have the same epistemology or not, I think links very well to indeed Hila's and Doreen's question. Well, my answer to this is that I do think that in all these cases, the decentralizing logic that I try to describe in the presentation of relying on private actors to address social concerns remains constant. I don't think that changes. But having said that, that doesn't mean that all different forms of legislation are could be equally subject to critique or try to accomplish exactly the same thing. And the differences in hardness or in softness and in differences of enforcement or the ways in which they might open windows for liability are opportunities that I think civil society actors and social movements and so on need to engage with and need to exploit. And that comes then to Hila's question, whether this is a distraction or a leverage for civil society. Well, for instance, as I try to highlight in the conclusion of my work, I am personally more in favor. I do think that our, let's say, normative horizon should be more ambitious and more centralized designs of and in more inclusive and fair international economic order. And as such, this would mean a very different way of thinking about global value chains and organizing them in the first place, and a very different role of states in such a process. But of course, that being said, that doesn't mean, and I don't think there is, while I think there is no reason to abandon this kind of vision, that doesn't mean that we should also give up to the opportunities presented by current instruments like Doreen and Hila just said, that in fact, indeed, they are, of course, legal instruments are subject to a certain degree of indeterminacy, and we could use them and see different things into them and attach different things to transparency and make it a way to pave way for liability and so on. And all that is very useful. So we should also be doing that while at the same time not losing the vision that these are, let's say, partial things that don't really amount to a massive, to a profound way of tackling modern slavery. Of course, when it comes to Hila's question, had a bit of also an element of, let's say, limitations. And I do realize that while this position is perhaps tenable on a theoretical level, in real life, you have limited resources and time. So maybe it's difficult to pursue both strategies that want to take advantage of transparency legislation or later on human rights due diligence legislation, and at the same time, advocate for a new type of international economic order that, let's say, challenges free trade and so on. So yes, this is a limitation I don't really have an answer to. And finally, for Dev, thank you for the point on formalizing power, on how contractual governance in global value chains might formalize power asymmetries. I'll try to make that more clear in the paper. It's true that sometimes it's hard to find very specific examples without really looking at a case study. Things that I had in mind is how at times suppliers might be forced, due to price pressure and competition, might be forced to assume disproportionate financial risk that we saw, I think, in the case of COVID. There were some journalistic articles that came out that described the situation that also allowed at the same time lead firms to disengage sort of unilaterally from contractual obligations with a very short time window. So that could be, for instance, one example of how power asymmetries can be also made as parts of formal contracts. And one last point from Doreen that I didn't address, and I actually don't have also an answer, is about remedying the global north, global south divide when it comes to regulation of global value chains. I don't know, Doreen, what you had in mind, but I'm not sure whether this type of legislation, like even in its most ambitious form, like the human rights due diligence legislation that is currently being discussed at the level of the EU, seems to be quite ambitious, but I'm still not sure whether there is maybe a structural default when it comes to this global north, global south divide and questions of legitimacy when such legislation is promulgated in the global north and is meant to bind essentially corporation lead firms, and then have such these lead firms sort of diffuse their own regulatory mechanisms in supply chains without having direct consultations with the workforce, with people who are actually meant to benefit from such regulation in the global south, where production actually takes place. So I'm not sure whether there is a way to remedy this without going through a stage of international negotiations, essentially through among formally equal sovereign states. But, yeah.
Thank you, Ioannis, very much. So I feel like tomorrow you have to speak. There's no other way. So thank you for joining
everyone.
us.
Okay. Bye, Deepaksha.
Bye,
Thank you,
Deepaksha.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank
Bye.
you.
See you tomorrow.